posed initially by some as the Civilization 6 killer, Humankind from Amplitude Studios has developed into a new contender within the 4X historical strategy game genre. Now comfortably sitting within its second year post-launch, and with development and expansion both behind it and ahead of it still, let's consider Humankind, a year one in review, if you will, by exploring how Humankind has changed and evolved over time, what potentially it could still be missing or looking to improve on in the near future, and ultimately how it stands up within the genre more broadly. Toward the end of the video, we'll also look at what is next for Humankind. This is quite the discussion piece, and it will of course be reflecting not only on the 5 things that Amplitude, as you can see here, announced or sort of discussed more recently in their video reflecting on Humankind, the fact that they've added end conditions, war support and forced surrender changes, balance changes, immersive player names, and of course, new DLC content. However, in my discussion, I'll take that a step further. Yes, I'll draw on those things because I think they're very important, but I'll add my own twist and flair to it. As a player who you may or may not already be familiar has made 1 or 2 videos on Humankind, but more importantly, I've logged hundreds of hours in this game across its life cycle, from the Cultures of Africa DLC to the more recent, of course, Cultures of Latin America DLC, and all of the patches throughout. Without any further ado, let's begin. The gameplay in the background, by the way, slightly supercut, brand new and fantastic, so please enjoy. Firstly though, before updates and gameplay changes, we have to consider the actual DLC, the expansions. Firstly, in January came the Cultures of Africa DLC pack. This introduced 6 new cultures that you can see on screen to Humankind. More importantly, it slightly changed the playstyle of the game. These cultures enabled us to broadly build districts outside of the normal boundaries, i.e. they didn't have to be adjacent. A lot of them could be placed in unique places, different places, like open desert where you could farm for food. You'll see a little bit of that later in the video. The second expansion, likewise one purely focused mainly on adding new cultures with a couple of other things around the edges, was, of course, the Latin America pack, where again we saw 6 additional cultures, a freebie released around the same time, the Mississippians. These cultures further developed Humankind's resources, trade, warfare system by introducing new mechanics across the board. Districts, again, were more flexible than before. Units had new abilities that we haven't seen before in Humankind, like the healer, for example. And, crucially, and my personal favorite, some of the later cultures, like the Argentinians, for example, have their own unique luxury or strategic resources that they can build with their own upsides, downsides, trade abilities, you name it, they've got it, let's talk. Either way, it's nice to see a little bit of extra flexibility be slowly teased in through these packs. And if I was a gambling man, which I may or may not be, I'd put my money on the fact that as we move forward, we should see more and more flexibility and customization. Although it's important to note that they still broadly remain true to the initial premise of Humankind, that thing that of course makes Humankind distinct and unique from other strategy games, and ultimately builds that Humankind experience by changing cultures as we move through the eras. The DLC packs also, of course, introduced a whole load of other sort of flavor elements into the game, into the base game, if you've got the DLC enabled. Everything from events to wonders, probably the most important one because you'll see them, indeed, in this video. Around the map, you can build them, of course, with the built wonders as well. And really everything that you would expect to encompass a game's DLC pack, including, of course, the soundtrack for Humankind, which remains fantastic. Now we get into some of the real meat, though, the changes that were actually made to the core game itself. The first category that I'm going to start with are game conditions. These were some of the ones that straight out of the gate put Humankind at quite a big disadvantage and were a frustration source for many players. There was the pollution effects, now off by default. They used to be very harsh and always on. Also, you'll see here end conditions as well. That's those sliders down the bottom there, Mars conquered, all empires eliminated, that kind of thing. Those also weren't in Humankind from release. These things we really ought to expect, and many players did anticipate that Humankind would release with them, because of course, one of the most logical comparisons is to look at Civilization. Some players will choose Civ 6, some players Civ 5. Those are two, of course, very different games from the same place. Humankind, of course, throws its hat in that ring as well, historical strategy, and therefore we carry through expectations. And I think that's important to keep in mind for the remainder of this video. However, more on the game end conditions. The other thing, really, I think that was more profound here also was the ability to turn off the turn limit. Another one, just like pollution, that was a real source of frustration for players, me included. I wanted to be able to play through beyond the turn limit or turn pollution off and not have it on by default. These things are now all adjustable. A fairly simple and straightforward change to how a Humankind game is set up, or indeed how it ends. However, there were some other game condition tweaks that they didn't mention in their video that I want to mention here that I found sometimes even more important. Most significantly, the resource spawn condition sliders. Now we have at least some control over the frequency of resources and also the quality of them too. Do you want more strategic resources on your map? Then you can slide that up to abundant. Do you want resources to be clustered together or scattered far apart? You can change that now too. It might sound simple, but really nailing these game conditions, the resource spawns, the map conditions, of course, as well. All of that stuff is fundamental to an enjoyable Humankind game experience. And I can say now, again, as a player with hundreds and hundreds of hours, and certainly a real enjoyment for Humankind, but also, of course, I bump into those same frustrations that you may do, and likely a lot more often because I play it a lot more often. I can confidently say that the game conditions are nicely rounded off and completed. They may see some, little tweaks as we move forward. Maybe there are more added in, or existing ones are changed with future DLCs. I don't know. But the important thing to note here is that, as far as I'm concerned, game conditions and game settings, big win, big change, and very happy. The next category, a broad one with a few different things within it, balancing. The most logical place to start, I think, is with the cultures. That may be where your mind moves first. Of course, Humankind has seen a huge variety of changes to the cultures. You could take the French as one example, incredibly overpowered at the start with their insane science gain. Then scientist affinities as a whole, as well as the French culture itself, were tweaked down, way down. And more recently, Amplitude have given the French culture specifically a lift back up. I think this reflects on their ability and willingness to change cultures. And of course, they are the French. So extra kudos to you for taking it that extra step and getting it just right. Because I think, broadly speaking, the changes that have been made so far have all been generally received in pretty good grace by me, by you, potentially my regular viewer, or if you are somewhat unfamiliar with Humankind, but maybe play it now and again or see a video or two, you've probably picked up that same impression. Most of the balancing, on balance, has been pretty good. There is another kind of layer to that, though. Outside of the individual cultures, I touched on it a little bit with the French, the broader balancing to cultural affinities. And this, I would argue, is actually much more important than individual changes to +4 influence or +5 stability on a district or whatever. The overall changes that they made by firstly bringing the nerf hammer down on the industrial cultures and the scientific cultures, game changing. They were generally must pick, always wins when the game first came out. I can now absolutely confidently say that's no longer the case. Not actually because they were nerfed either, I would argue, but rather because their alternatives were buffed. I'm thinking in particular of the aesthete influence cultures. Their affinity ability now is worth using, but actually it goes across the board. Expansionist stars easier to earn, and using their ability to kind of steal an outpost out from under your opponents without having to necessarily draw too many arms is a great call. Across the board, I think the thing that they've done the best with the cultural balancing has been balancing the overall affinities in Humankind. I think that is a job well done. More to do? Probably, but a job well done. The second element within balancing next logically kind of leads to units. Maybe that was where your mind went first if you're more of a warlord in Humankind. Either way, unit changes are something that I think probably need more work. Am I incredibly frustrated when I play with them? No. However, are they perfect? I don't think so. I think there are ongoing improvements that could be made around not only individual unit combat strengths, although those have been changed generally quite favorably and fairly extensively, but also to some of the interesting mechanics that units bring with them. Here I'm thinking in particular, of course, of stealth, which is something on their hit list for future updates and changes to Humankind, but it's a mechanic that is really fascinating, but perhaps somewhat underused, and dare I say, maybe a little misunderstood as well, perhaps hard to understand. So there are still changes to be made. However, I would argue that unit balancing across the board and some of the changes to some of those existing mechanics like line of sight, now much easier to understand through a couple of fairly simple UI changes. You'll see those play out as this gameplay starts to ramp up. No spoilers. And then I think the last element to balancing, or at least the last key one that I want to reflect on in this video, is balancing changes to the AI. Many of you will play in multiplayer. Most of you, perhaps most of the time anyway, will be playing single player games in Humankind. So the AI is really quite important. Even in a multiplayer setting though, the AI of course controls any player that isn't a human, including the independent peoples and every other non-player managed sort of asset or process in the game. So it's very important nonetheless, especially if your mate disconnects. AI has been a really difficult one to judge because unlike a lot of other metrics in the game, like your unit that has now got +2 movement but lost a combat strength or whatever, there isn't really a lot of data I can assign to it except for anecdotal evidence, mostly of my own, but also of, shout out to the very generous channel members in our members Discord. Shout out to you if you're a member on YouTube or a subscriber on Twitch. Sorry, that was a little bit maybe overexcited. Back to the point. The AI, I think, despite not being able to judge it necessarily that clearly, has been improved significantly. If you go through the patch notes, which of course I have done with basically every single update that's ever came out for Humankind, and covered it here on the channel and loved doing it, for the most part. Sometimes the early starts are less than ideal. I've noticed the AI does tend to get better and better and better. It's not just in its decision making in battles either. It's when it chooses a culture, when it chooses to move through. The AI, for example, hangs around in eras a bit longer, particularly on higher difficulties that I tend to play on. I should note I'm probably more speaking about those rather than the lower ones. I've noticed the AI is better at collecting fame, basically, in every era, and that makes it a much stronger opponent. I've also noticed the AI is much more competitive in the both extreme early and extreme late game. Those were two areas that were particularly difficult. Like a lot of strategy games, it tended to be either very vulnerable at the start and or unable to really scale and ramp like you may be able to do as the player right toward the end. They've done good work at fixing that, as well as shoring up some of its weaknesses, like, for example, coastal sieges, an important change within these updates. But also, I think a couple of other broader areas as well, not just culture selection, but what units to build, where to send them and place them. All of those sorts of behaviors, I think, have improved. Are they perfect? Are they like a human brain? No. Well, I mean, probably some human brains, to be fair, but no, the AI isn't perfect. It's absolutely imperfect. And a close viewer will maybe see that play out here when I swap between automatic fighting and manual fighting in a couple of these fights throughout the video. But nonetheless, overall, when I reflect on the AI balancing improvements, a win. The unit improvements, a win with more work to do, and the culture balancing, and particularly on the affinities, I think, again, a win. Overall, the balancing for Humankind, I would argue, has been pretty successful in its first year. More to be done, probably. And especially, of course, every time a new DLC update comes out, there are 13 new cultures into the mix. This turned what was something like 1.1 million possible combinations of culture. Of course, we initially had 10 in each of the 6 eras where we can choose. That then went to 11, that then went to 12, 13, and some. We went from 1 million combinations to 1.6 million, and of course it just really exponentially grows from there. It's always going to be a little bit challenging to balance something like this, And I would argue a little bit more philosophically that if you do perfectly balance it, you're probably missing out on just a little bit of the fun. However, let's move along to the next point. And that is all about war support and forced surrender. As you can see on screen, relatively recently these were changed in the Bolivar update. And man alive, were they changed for the better. One of the most frustrating things that, again, was particularly, I think, a gripe at launch for Humankind and for many players was the fact that you could just kind of somewhat randomly, feelingly be forced to just surrender and lose a war and lose a whole load of stuff and have no idea maybe how or potentially even why it happened. There are a few things that changed to fix this. Let me give you my highlights. Firstly, voluntary forced surrender has been added instead of just forced surrender. Basically what that means is now you have the choice to continue pushing on with a fight, or you can force your opponent to lose when you have adequate war support over them. So the war support system remains, but it takes more of a focus on things that aren't specifically word for word coded into the game, but may relate to you as players or just more broadly as people interested in this kind of thing. Things like attrition, the cost of war, the attrition of war, the morale of your troops and of your people is all sort of now captured within the war support system. And that's used to leverage that voluntary surrender and, of course, determine how much you can take or whether you want to vassalize them, that kind of thing. All of these things are supported by an underlying system, therefore, of war support. War support behaves a little bit more differently now than it used to as well. It interacts much more closely with things like pillaging districts in foreign land, for example. Every fight, whether it's one unit that's perished or many, will cost your opponent war support and gain you some, assuming, of course, you're the victor. But even then, a victor who takes a lot of losses in the process won't really gain any war support from doing it. And this is what I mean about the system becoming a bit more nuanced. You may win a fight, but lose almost an entire army in the process. And the negative war support, the costs on your morale, and understandably how your people or troops may feel about the conflict, is therefore played out in real terms. You can see it much easier than you used to be able to as well. It's much more upfronted in all of the ways you can do it. The system now works pretty well. However, there are still some gaps in it. One of them, addressed in an update likely in Q4 of 2022, is reinforcements. So you can have an ally and all this war support stuff, it's all very good, but what happens when your ally wants to reinforce you with their army? Well, at the moment, it's virtually impossible. That will be changing, and it'll be a little bit easier for aggressors to kind of take control of their allies' armies, is my understanding, as if they were their own troops. So a step in the right direction, and also an example of one area where the sort of broader war support, surrender, broader combat mechanics, I guess you could argue, just need a little bit more work. However, the forced surrender changes are huge. As a player of Humankind, if I step aside from someone who spends time like evaluating the updates and making the content and that side of thing, I've noticed it makes warfare a little bit more enjoyable for me now too. It's a little bit easier to understand, and it feels like the population and the army better reflect that sort of somewhat mystical will of the people that's hard to capture but makes sense. The nice thing, of course, now though, is we have the ability to push on and push through even when we're faced with attrition, and keep on fighting and grabbing so that you can gain, in theory, as much land or resources or whatever it may be that you think you deserve. So war now, in a nutshell, is able to be protracted and prolonged, and that is good for more aggressive players potentially like me. My fifth category is a little bit of a grab bag of the leftovers. I'm going to call it broadly the transparency of the game and how we understand it. Let's call it game transparency. Here I'm talking about a few key changes that make a massive difference. Things like how line of sight works in combat. A great change to the accessibility and transparency of the game. Another one that I haven't yet mentioned, civic conditions. So now, on this screen, I can actually hover over any of those civics and understand what I need to do to unlock them and what benefits they will give me. A great win. Loads of little things like this. More colors to be able to be assigned to empires and specific empire names that last across eras. So it's easier to understand and identify who is who on this wonderful world, particularly as they move through cultures. The overall transparency and understandability, if you will, of Humankind has therefore, I argue, improved. Is this a massive step? No, but I thought it was worthy of a mention here, alongside another rapid-fire list of important things that I think should be mentioned that I'd like to reiterate, if I've already mentioned them a little bit already, that weren't highlighted by the Humankind team themselves. Strategic and luxury resource spawn control, both in quality and spread. Coastal sieges now work properly, a huge win. Mod.io integration is not perfect, but it has come a long way. And my goodness, there's some fan-freaking-tastic mods for this game. Seriously. Not just custom maps, although I am a sucker for a True Earth map. Absolutely. But also modded cultures and gameplay features and mechanics, VIP balance updates that stretch across eras. We have fantastic mods that fix or improve, I should say, naval mechanics in the game and warfare on that front. We have modded packs that add all sorts of flavorful fun. The Cultures of Nintendo mod pack, for example. So I think that system is worthy of at least a shout out for the considerable but not yet perfect support improvements and integration within Humankind game as well. And lastly, but not least, unit combat strength and visibility changes. I think we've covered that off fairly well. I won't jump into that any further, but it has made combat more enjoyable as a whole. Now, let's reflect then a little bit on the other question that I posed at the start. Humankind as a Civilization 6 killer. How does it fare and where does it stand? Fundamentally, here we're asking Humankind versus Civilization 6. I find the question to be, as someone who's really into historical strategy games and likes the detail and likes the nuances and differences, a question that maybe isn't entirely practical, but man, it does make sense because, like I say, they are both historical 4X strategy games, so let's talk. I think that Humankind, now with 1 year of post-launch development, is not quite in its, say, final form over 9,000 just yet. And we know, as I'll reflect on at the very end of the video, what's next for Humankind basically all but confirms that. Civilization 6 has had 6 years of post-launch development, and now a year to kind of sit around and twiddle its thumbs. Humankind is in year 2, so there's a little ways to go. Did Humankind quote-unquote KILL Civ 6? Absolutely not. And really, you'd probably be either a wishful thinker or slightly the fool to assume that, I joke, but to assume that a new entrant in a new franchise, a new IP like Humankind, even with a studio like Amplitude, who have, of course, built the Endless Universe and Endless Legend, Endless Space strategy games already, to consider a new entrant would be able to break in and break up the decades-long stronghold that the fantastic Sid Meier's Civilization series has held would be, I think, at the very least, very optimistic. That is to say, Humankind will not dethrone Civilization 6. If we reflect on what little statistics we have available, like Steam player count, it, of course, also shows a sharp decline in players from Humankind's mixed reception at launch through to now, with some peaks and troughs throughout around updates and particular points of interest. This is, of course, not dissimilar to any, or at least almost any game in existence ever on Steam. However, it's important to note that Humankind did launch with a very mixed reception, and there were, I would argue, a lot of players who have rightly or wrongly carried through that fair comparison and logical comparison with games like Civilization 6 and been left disappointed by some of the things that we've discussed that have improved or been fixed in Humankind within its first year of development. So then, Humankind vs. Civ 6 in a nutshell, and to put it here inside of this video because I think it is important, although if really it probably deserves another entire video of its own, is perhaps not necessarily a fair question. I say this though, fully acknowledging I am biased because I like them both. Flame me if you will, but I really do. They are slightly different experiences, but they both capture a love of history and geography and geopolitics of mine. Humankind leans more into that era-by-era fame mechanic about the journey rather than the destination, where Civilization 6 leans more into those historical leaders and much more of a sort of a more real feeling history, graphics and that kind of thing aside, then Humankind's slightly more flexible but still absolutely historically bound and richly bound cultures and fame-based system. If you'd like a more detailed full update on how these two very important games compare, I do have some existing content on the channel, and I'll be looking to update that as well as we move through and Humankind continues to develop. Speaking of which, that is probably a fantastic segue to move into the final part of this video, my concluding thoughts and what's next for Humankind. Firstly, the conclusion. Today I've discussed 5 broad categories of things that have changed in Humankind. Its first year in review, if you will, and we've also reflected a little bit on how it relates to that massive elephant in the room, Civilization 6. We've talked about the new content that's come to Humankind in the form of culture packs, 2 of the changes to game conditions and settings that have helped build a more solid foundation for Humankind, alongside balance changes. Those units, cultures, and of course that other one I argue is quite important, the AI. Then we had the war support, allowing us to continue prolonged combat and make the war support numerical system feel a little bit more aligned with morale and the will of the people in the army and the empire, if you will. We've also reflected a little bit on the game's transparency, and of course overall, how does it then sit compared to Civ 6? Which one might you want to put your time into, and how do my thoughts and feelings as a content creator and someone who spent hundreds of hours playing the game compare? I hope you've enjoyed that reflection, and there is of course but one more thing to consider: what's next for Humankind? And thankfully, we already kind of know that in probably Q4 of 2022, there will be the first full expansion for Humankind. Civilization 6, of course, received arguably 2 to 3 of these, Humankind receiving its first now. Together we rule. This pack will introduce a whole load of new diplomacy and geopolitical features to Humankind, and it will undoubtedly be accompanied by a whole load of updates moving forward. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.